Tonight, we'll be covering a topic that musicologists have been discussing for quite some time, Baroque ornamentation. But before getting into the nitty-gritty, let's go over some necessary terms and definitions. First, what is Baroque? The Baroque period is the period of time spanning between 1600 and 1750 and is often associated with the works of Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel. Originally, the term Baroque was meant as a derogatory term in reference to an irregularly shaped or imperfect pearl. Historians started using the term to describe this time period about a century ago. According to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baroque music is that in which the harmony is confused, charged with modulations and dissonances. The melody is harsh, the intonation difficult, and the movement constrained. During the Baroque era, composers started using a new musical texture, which became known as homophony. Before this period, composers used a more complex texture of polyphony. Another quality of the Baroque era was the attempt to capture a specific affect or emotion within a movement or a work, whether it is happy or sad. An ornament is a brief embellishment of notes provided by the performer. Ornamentation originally comes from a tradition of improvisation, and when used in written music, they are identified through various symbols, such as these. However, these symbols were never really the same. The symbols would vary depending on location and time. As time went on, ornaments were organized into universal symbols. Let's get into these symbols and see when they were used, what they represent, how to approach them in music, and the composer's expectation in using them. Today, when we look at a piece of music, we have the mindset that says what the composer has written is law, meaning the composer's expectations are on the page. Deviate from the page, and it is no longer being played correctly. In other words, we must play what is written. The composer has a musical idea, and the performer interprets it. This was not the case in the Baroque era. Instead, the performer's interpretation was equally as important as what the composer has wrote. Musicians were given large creative responsibilities, since they were expected to know how to improvise. Performers had liberty in taking part in creating a work, making it their own. Many composers left the ornamentation of a line to the performer. Others did not. Another reason for such responsibility was due to the difference in national styles. A piece performed in Germany would not be performed the same way in England. Now that we've briefly covered the relationship between the performer and the composer, let's get into the heart and soul of Baroque music, the ornaments. It is important to note that during the Baroque era, there are various ways to notate ornaments, since there were no universal symbols. Again, this stems from the difference in styles between nations. Today, there are universal notations for each ornament. The first ornament we will be discussing is the Appoggiatura. This phrase comes from the Italian appoggiare, meaning to lean. An appoggiatura is a note that comes before a melodic note, either above or below, stealing some of its rhythmic value. This auxiliary note, as it is commonly called, is then slurred into the main note. C.P.E. Bach and Quantz emphasize that an appoggiatura improves the melody since it links notes together, creating motion, and it gives more life to the harmony by creating dissonance. Since the auxiliary note creates a dissonance, it should be stressed more than the main melodic note, allowing the dissonance to be emphasized and heard. When executing an appoggiatura, there are many theories regarding its placement. Some believe it should be placed before the pulse. Others say on the pulse. These discrepancies occur since the auxiliary note varies in length, since appoggiatura lengths are determined by the following rule. While the appoggiatura is written as a small eighth note, it is not always played as one. CPE Bach's rule regarding appoggiatura length says that they take from a note of duple length 1/2 its value and 2/3 from one of triple length. This means the auxiliary note will have half the value of the preceding note. Quarter note if followed by a half note, an eighth if followed by a quarter, and so on. Likewise, if the preceding note is dotted, such as a dotted half note or a quarter note, the auxiliary note will be 2/3 of the original note's length. It is important to note that the auxiliary note and the principal note must be played within the originally stated rhythmic value. Let's look at a few examples. I have an appoggiatura leading into a quarter note. The auxiliary note will then be given the value of an eighth note. It would sound like so. Likewise, if the appoggiatura occurs on a dotted quarter note, the auxiliary note would be sustained for a quarter note and the main for an eighth note. This is according to the principle of CPE Bach's 2/3 rule, and sounds like such. Quants believed that short appoggiaturas were part of the preceding note. This was one of the exceptions to some of the rules of the appoggiatura. This would create a dotted 8/16 pattern. Typically, the appoggiatura is played as an even pattern in accordance to CPE Bach's rule. The next big ornament we will be discussing is the trill. Much like the appoggiatura, a trill in the Baroque era begins on an upper auxiliary note, often a semitone above, on the beat, and descends to the principal note. The descent is very quick and is followed by alternations between the principal note, the auxiliary, and back. These alternations are not measured, so they can be played as fast or slow as the performer desires, but must be played within the rhythmic value of the principal note. When terminating the trill, the last sounding pitch must be the principal note. However, the composer may end with a suffix or two small notes attached to the end, like so. And both would sound a little something like this. The trill has two functions in a performance. One is a melodic function, by providing harmonic color and rhythmic decoration. The other function is to intensify the harmony. While both functions occurred during the Baroque era, the most common function was the harmonic. Trills with a harmonic function are referred to as cadential trills. Like its name suggests, these trills occur near authentic cadences in Baroque music. These trills, much like normal trills, occur from an upper auxiliary note and often have suffixes attached to them, such as an anticipation. Much like the appoggiatura, a cadential trill creates dissonance with the harmony before releasing to a consonance. It sounds a little something like so. Trills, also like appoggiaturas, have exceptions to its rules. There is much debate over which pitch to begin the trill on. As stated earlier, it was common practice to begin the trill from the upper auxiliary note. However, there are some arguments that state it can begin on the written pitch, though it was not common throughout the Baroque era. Typically, trills involve quite a few alternations between the principal and auxiliary note, but there is a shorter embellishment known as the half trill. A half trill is played very quickly, only allowing two alternations or four notes to occur. Much like the normal trill, half trills start with an upper auxiliary note and begin on the pulse. These trills are one of the more difficult embellishments, but according to C.P. Bach, are the most attractive. The next embellishment is the mordent, coming from the Latin term mordere, meaning to bite. Mordents begin on the pulse and alternate between a main note and an auxiliary note, then back again. This embellishment enhances the harmony by adding a non-harmonic tone, though it serves a primarily rhythmic function. Unlike the trill or the appoggiatura, a mordent can have an upper or lower auxiliary note, usually in the interval of a half step. In order to determine the auxiliary note, there's a slight difference in notation. An upper auxiliary note is marked with this symbol, which looks like an M, and is split apart like so. While a lower auxiliary note has a line through the middle of the M, something like this. The rules of the mordent are very strict, and there are no exceptions to them. They quickly add a bite to a main note and then return with the auxiliary note, and then they return, and that is it. Our next ornament is the turn. A turn is a circling around a main note with an upper and a lower auxiliary note. Turns occur on the beat, and their auxiliary notes can be either a half or a whole step away from the main note. Unlike other embellishments, there are various ways to begin a turn. The standard Baroque turn will begin on an upper auxiliary note, which then falls to the main note and to the lower auxiliary and returns to the main. Another way to begin is on the lower auxiliary note, which will rise to the main, then to the upper auxiliary, and fall to the main again. The final way to play a turn, and perhaps the most common, occurs when a turn is placed in between two notes. It then starts in the main note, moves to the upper auxiliary, falls to the main again, then again to the lower auxiliary, and returns to the main. Placing the first two styles of turns is very simple, since all the note values will give even lengths. With the final style, the turn must be able to fit into the available time. This allows for some variance in length. The final ornament I would like to briefly touch on is the slide. Slides are 2 or 3 note embellishments that often occur before or on the beat, much like modern grace notes. Normally, these embellishments were not written in music since they originate from free ornamentation. Much like the appoggiatura, slides may be played in equal value or in slower movements in dotted values. The example above we may fill with even slides, such as so. Now that we have covered the main ornaments of the Baroque era, let's look at a few actual music examples, starting with Philip Telemann's Fantasia No. 1, which I played earlier. The first piece of the program was a collection of 12 fantasies composed by Telemann in 1733. Originally, this collection was composed for solo flute without basso continuo, entitled 12 Fantasias for Flute Without Picks. Now, what is a fantasia? A fantasia, as defined by Groves, is a term adopted in the Renaissance for an instrumental composition whose form and invention spring solely from the imagination of the composer. That being said, no performance will ever be the same. Without a bass line or basso continuo, the performer has freedom to manipulate tempo throughout each movement. For example, the first movement is marked as vivace, but the soloist is not required to play the movement at a constant 165 beats per minute. They may never play that fast. In my performance, I begin with a fairly slow tempo that proceeds to a cello rondo to the end of the first phrase. This helps me display my virtuosity on the instrument. From then on, I push the tempo up and down according to the phrase as I see fit. Once the manipulations of tempo are established, our next task is to identify points for ornamentation. Unlike original Baroque works, modern transcriptions have some ornaments already added into the printed music. The mordent in the beginning of the second phrase is an example of such an ornament. This was added by an editor or an arranger. However, just because they are included does not mean they have to be followed. What ornaments are used in a performance of a work are entirely up to the performer. In this case, I can decide to ignore the Mordent, play it, or add a turn or trill instead. Also, transcriptions can have ornaments added to them. For example, the penultimate measure of this movement, I decided to place my own Mordent on beat 4. This adds variation to the motive that repeats 4 times. I decided not to use as many trills, turns, or appoggiaturas in order to focus on a flashier, more virtuosic work. They also considered filling in intervals as ornaments as well. Baroque musicians also changed articulations and rhythmic values as well. Another common Baroque technique is used in the Allegro movement that deals with repeated sections. During the Baroque era, it was common to exclude any ornamentation during the first repetition of a theme. This allows for the audience to clearly hear the melodic line before the performer makes changes to the line. Ornamentation is then added upon the second repetition of a section, like the second repetition of the Allegro. I've modified some of the articulations in the Allegro. For example, measure 44. Telemann originally notates tongue 3, slur 3. As mentioned earlier, the first repetition is played as written. When I approach the pattern in the second repetition, I invert the articulation to slur 3, tongue 3. Much like the Vivace, I've also added slides to the movement, starting with the first measure of the Allegro. While there is nothing wrong with the original notation, it just sounds very simple. By adding a few one-note slides, we can make the measure more exciting. Tonight's second work is a work by Johann Sebastian Bach, his concerto in G minor, the Adagio movement. One of the characteristics of Baroque music, as mentioned earlier, was the attempt to express a specific affect or emotion. Typically, one feeling or affect was captured per movement. The Adagio of Johann Sebastian Bach's concerto in G minor, we feel a sense of lament or longing. Originally, this work was written for harpsichord and was reconstructed by Bach later as a violin concerto. For this slow movement, there are fewer ornaments than in the Telemann. One thing to note is that the articulation markings are excluded from this movement. This allows for the phrases to be varied. Many of the ornaments that are included are placed near cadences. This technique was common throughout the Baroque era to highlight the end of a musical phrase. Meanwhile, the ornaments that I have included help emphasize the mood of the movement. The most common ornament that I've added is the appoggiatura. Typically, an appoggiatura creates a sighing effect for all appoggiaturas moved down. My goal was to keep the emotions of the movement flowing through its entirety. The gentle nature of this work allows for the widespread use of the appoggiatura. Measures 11, 12, and 13, to me, seem to really capture the feeling of this movement. The phrase begins with a variation of the opening theme. I will first play the opening theme and then the variation.